that I also was surprised how much experimentation, how much digital projects started quite quickly after the first lockdown in German organizations. And at the same time, I find it hard to talk about the past year as one experience, because I also find there's very distinct experiences, even with some very optimistic moments at the very beginning, when I had the feeling that many people in the field, and including myself, really experienced a kind of, well, this will be the moment when a lot of the transformation that hasn't been, that people didn't dare to follow in the arts, for example, embracing the digital sphere much more stronger, started. But looking at the fall and now the current moment in the winter, I think there's much more skepticism around, and this feeling of loss and exhaustion. So a lot of the positive surprises from the first moments seem a bit naive in a way in today's light, and probably that's what Jonathan, what you refer to as the flip side, and acknowledging the flip sides. So for me, it's really like it's mixed surprises, positive as well as quite dark ones in a way.
Catherine, are you back, right? Oh, yeah.
I don't think you can see me yet, but
no.
Martin, could we turn over to you, please?
No, I just I just followed up, so I gave my statement.
I was completely, I couldn't hear anything. Okay, so with that then, could we turn to the sort of three groupings of questions, and the first one being this reflection or your observations on cultural leadership over the past year. And were there leadership qualities, not necessarily skills, but the skills could come in as well, but specifically qualities that have risen up and proven to be the most effective and most needed in weathering the crisis that we've been through, or we're in the middle of? Let's see, let's do a little bit of an order in here. Johan, would you like to start on that?
So which qualities of leadership are necessary?
Yeah, what you observed as being the things that had risen to the fore and absolutely most needed in getting through or responding to it.
It's difficult not to use the usual words like innovation and thinking out of the box, but I think there's also a fundamental thing which I think, looking at cultural leadership more from the perspective of the experience than the production.
Yeah.
I would like to. Can I illustrate that for a second?
Please.
We had to, let's focus for a bit on performing arts. We had experiences at the beginning of the lockdown in Groningen, where the local theatre group was forced to go online with a production, and they had the fortunate opportunity to be able to make a really good registration, a video registration. So that happened, and they the number of people watching the registration was about 10 times as many as they would have had in the hall for the first performance. There were 14,000 unique visitors on the website. There were breakout groups where people were chatting about the performance with the actors in the performance, because these actors were at their home, sitting on the bench with a beer, looking at the same images as the audiences were. And that's really, and we've had other experiences like that, quantitative. There was an annual concert for Dutch pop music in Rotterdam, in Ahoy, which houses about 10,000 to 12,000 people. It was done online, and it was watched by 500,000 people. And what at this conference is 3 times as big as it was last year. And what these things have in common is that they were free. Now you can argue, oh, that's a problem, because in our world we need to be able to make money from what we present. But at the same time, you could say, what is self-generated income really? How important is it for the sustainability of the arts world? Should it be? Doesn't this flag the realization that the handing out at least some of the performing arts for free will have gigantic impact on audience engagement? There's been, of course, some really interesting research done on digital audio engagement by Ben Walmsley in Leeds. And there's really a world to be discovered there, and that brings in responsibilities for cultural leaders who create, but also those who intermediate, who are business managing things, because this is a system changer, I think.
So you're talking about a need for an entire rethink of the business model, if we could put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Jonathan.
So.
Sorry, Johan, you want to?
Yeah, well, just a final thing that you could say that what we've heard very often for the past year, there's nothing like the live experience of performing arts. In a way, yes, that's true. In a way, it's also a myth. And we know from newer generations, research has been done on that in the visual arts, that the question whether a work of art is being presented live or on a tablet screen does not make that much difference for the experience that people have to evaluate how it connects to their own life experience. And I think that's something we have to take very, very seriously, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah, I think for me, there's perhaps 3 different levels of response which are important to look at, and it throws up some of the fault lines in the definitions of cultural leadership that we sometimes might work with, because the traditional idea of cultural leadership is that it's about leaders in the cultural sector, people running creative organizations, and of course it does include those people, but actually it includes everybody else who wields influence in that field, and who affects the circumstances in which it operates. So, the huge importance has been the response at the policy level, and what in a time of absolute crisis and the complete disturbance of all the income streams, what's been put in place in terms of emergency funding. And I know there are various different pictures as far as that's concerned across different parts of Europe. I can comment on the UK situation, but certainly that sense of what's been put in place, how effective that's been, how long-term the thinking has been, but also what some of the political attitudes to the cultural sector are that have been communicated. These levels have been really, really important. And I think another level that often gets forgotten when we talk about cultural leadership is simply the level of the artists and what artists are doing and what they're doing with their art forms, whether they're working within large organizations or whether they're working individually. And possibly it was artists who were visible as individuals first in making those early kind of digital responses and making things just happen in their communities, perhaps in naive ways sometimes, but just responding in the way that artists do. A live situation is going on, and artists have a different way of looking at it, a set of values to bring into that, and a way of connecting with their communities. But for the people who are running cultural organizations, I think one of the absolutely key I think you said attributes, the qualities that they've been using it's got to be around communication. The communication challenges are absolutely vast, whether it is about how you connect with publics and communicate what's going on in your organization, or how you communicate within your organization and keep often very frightened staffs engaged on board and in fact in employment, and what you do when that's not actually possible. So a great degree of trust has to be involved there as well. So I think the people who are able to operate most powerfully are those who are trusted by the people that depend on them, and who are able to operate very effectively with a great communication demand.
Well, I would say also that trust is a very important thing in the first level you were talking about in terms of policy response as well. Trust of the sector of policy. And one of the interesting things that have come out of an earlier panel was the membership organization or the representative organization for the museum sector. And I was really struck by the comment where they said that they had been previously generally dealt with one ministry. This is in the Netherlands, one ministry, and now they deal with 7+. So it's an interesting shift in the need in a crisis like this, which is societal wide, that it doesn't get focused in as a crisis just for the cultural sector. I mean, what happens in that sector is specific maybe to the sector, but making sure that the cultural sector is embraced in the policy understanding of wider society. And I think where leadership has come forward to recognize that has probably been exemplary. But as you mentioned, every context is quite different in the policy level response. But that important quality of trust is, I think, something to really remember. Martin.
Yeah, I can relate to everything that's been said, and probably just want to add two more aspects, which might be particular to the German context, but also be interesting to compare the experiences from other places. One relates to the internal side of cultural leadership, so what Jonathan referred to as like leading artistic or cultural organizations. And in Germany, that still is very much a heroic approach in terms of that there's an artistic director who more or less has all the power and even is granted the constitutional right of the freedom of the arts. It's actually not a freedom of the artist, it's a freedom of the leader of the artistic institution. And within their organization, they can more or less reign as a king. And I think one of the qualities that the pandemic has forced upon these very old school heroic leaders is to let go, because in the moment when the organizations were closed and people started working from home, it wasn't possible to control them the way they could when they were all still in their offices. And I think a lot of the experimentation and also a lot of this optimism that I spoke of in that first few weeks and months also stemmed from people suddenly being able to experiment on a level and trying out things and also making mistakes that they weren't allowed by their top leadership in the times before. And I think one of the big challenges is this quality of letting go, of giving space, of trusting bottom-up initiatives and also the wisdom and the professionalism on the deeper levels of an organization from the very top. That's something I experienced in those first few months, but I also have the experience it started to decline already, and we're in a way going back to more control, more top-down notions. So that quality seems to be in decline again, and I think that's will be a huge challenge whether we can have this more collaborative approach of leadership, which also was part of Helene's presentation before this panel. I would hope that can be somehow brought into a future and kept alive. And at the second level goes to this other dimension of cultural leadership that also Jonathan referred to, which I might frame as an organization being a leader towards their community. So arts organizations like looking into the future of where a community might develop, where municipality and an urban community might develop. And in that respect, I was hoping for a leadership quality that artistic organizations and the people running them would use the pandemic to see their organizations as a resource for their community to actually cope with the pandemic. And I think there are some examples where that really did happen, but there are also a lot of examples where I was very frustrated, again, in the German context, with an extreme overestimation of the relevance of the work the organizations were doing for communities. And just to give an example, there were a number of interviews where, for example, artistic directors of theater said, well, if you keep schools open, you need to keep the theaters open because we're as important. And I doubt that is the experience of the broader public. And I think that many people with small kids at home will find the need to have schools open before theaters quite important. And it struck me as like really a very much a notion of this artistic organizational bubble, to think that they're much more essential in the experience of a broader public than they might be to a lot of people. And I don't think that has to be the case, but I think this disconnect of catering to a very small community in many cases, but thinking to be really at the core of society, got quite visible. And I would love for artistic institutions to like deliver on that promise, but I think right now it's more a delusion sometimes that they have.
Sounds like wanting this embedded or deep-seated sense of entitlement within the cultural sector, I think especially in a highly subsidized situation, or relatively highly subsidized situation, rather than a sense of responsibility
exactly.
to the public and to the audience and participants. As Johan started out, the positive thing would be to looking at the experience rather than the production itself. So when the production, if we're talking about organizationally, is above all else, and the need to keep that business going, then the responsibility of the theater in that case, or whatever, has to the community is lost. So
exactly.
Johan.
Also, well, I was thinking about another aspect of this perspective shift, which is that there's a lot of support structure being put in place in Holland for cultural independent producers. And they are all rationalized from the argument that the crisis has severely impacted their income, which of course is true and horrible enough in itself. But if that sector would fall over, then what would happen to the people that most of these cultural sector independents work with? The people who sing in choirs, who do all kinds of sculpture, amateur cultural activities. So keeping the sector alive is definitely an economic and a humanitarian act, but at the same time, the effect of what they do, if that disappears, that would have grave consequences for what I always call the mental cultural health of an entire society.
Yeah. Perhaps if there's anyone wants to pose a question to this, Nikki Günther, you had put a question already in the chat. Would you like to raise that now?
Oh yeah, I already put it a while ago.
Yeah.
It was talked about in the beginning about that the optimism was in the beginning due to digitalization, but then in the winter now we experience a setback and it's less positive, the outlook. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. I think it was Martin who raised this decline of optimism in the winter.
Yeah, I'm happy to at least make a start regarding that question. For me, it's the digital is one aspect of it, because also I think one of the experiences that really shifted and where the flip side, like Jonathan said, got visible, is that the first experiments of the spring 21 quite often were around just like doing productions you would have been doing in the physical space and putting them into a digital format just by, for example, filming them, streaming them. And of course, that was a great thing to bridge a few weeks where organizations were closed. But if we're talking about months and potentially like more than a year now, I think what also got very visible is that digital has its logics in its own right. And if you really want to have like an equivalent of the experience side again, you can't just like film a physical stage or film a physical concert. You need to really like work with the aesthetics and the particularities of the digital space. And I think there were a number of projects which did that. And I would agree with Johan. They also showed the huge potential of the digital space for artistic experience on par with an artistic experience in a physical space. But it were the few ones which really tried to do something specific, not those which just like try to copy and paste something from a physical space. And I think that also is part of the skepticism or this frustration. And in my experience, again, very much taken from the German context, many organizations said, well, we did the experiments now, and now please let us open again. So I don't see that openness to really substantially use the current moment and the second lockdown and the knowledge that actually we're talking about more months, not more days, of the organizations being closed, to really fundamentally say, well, this is a chance to embrace a whole new sphere and develop a whole new stage for us. So I am skeptical about how long-term, how sustainable will be the effects, and will organizations really embrace the digital sphere, so to open up like an artistic sphere in its own right. But it's not just the digital, it's also, for example, audience development, and we could go to many levels. I found an openness in the first few months that I don't see in many organizations anymore. The discourse in Germany for many organizations really is, we've suffered enough, let's open the doors again, let's cater to our same audience, and let's do the productions that we had to cancel a year ago now. And I don't think that's a sufficient answer, but it's something I hear quite often.
Martin, is there an element at all from your perspective in the field of whether it's theater or live performance that is actually recognizing that we are maybe fundamentally changed, that it's not going to go back to exactly the way it was? We hope that there's some element of live performance that can happen, but is there, do you not see any kind of glimmers of hope of people that are saying, this is changing, and I'm finding, or we are finding, a creative way to move forward and still both make the art and engage with people in ways that are meaningful, not only just with digital, but maybe knowing that it would be limited physical engagement you've got, that people have. Did you see any sort of leaders in that way are saying we have to think differently?
Well, I do, and there is, like, there are the positive examples also in the German context. But the broader impression is that which makes me skeptical. But there are organizations in Hamburg, like Kampnagel, probably the biggest performing arts space in Germany for contemporary performing arts. They really try a lot also to have, like, engage with the audience, do digital productions which are really meant for the digital space. And there are other examples of organizations which are very innovative in that space. But if you consider the broader landscape, in my experience, these are well, the outliers, and the mainstream seems to at the moment be around trying to get back to a normality or normalcy, which should be questioned much more fundamentally. And I'd be very interesting also to hear whether that's something very particular to the German and also highly subsidized, as you said, Catherine, German system, whether there's more innovation and more embracing of new opportunities in other countries, in the experience of the panelists and also the participants.
Yeah, I heard a wonderful quote recently, which was, the person said, why are everyone rushing to get back to normal when normal was the problem?
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a question from Sophie Byrne, who's asking what the panel considers to have been the best advantage of going digital for cultural organizations. Does anybody want to weigh in on that one? And Sophie, would you like to turn your camera on?
I'll weigh in if you like. Well,
yeah. Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. Yeah. My question is just basic, because you all spoke of different things, and so I really just wanted to know, for you personally, what was the one thing that cultural organizations did best in response to moving digitally? So it could be in their audience engagement strategy, or it could be in their leadership style, it could be in just the team management wise. So,
shall I start with that one? Hi, Sophia.
Hi, John.
I think I come back to the thing of paradoxes, I think, because I think, I mean, one of the things that arts organisations, certainly in the UK, and especially from the subsidised sector, did very well by going digital, was to demonstrate to their funders that they were still relevant and putting some things out for the public. But they weren't necessarily doing the same sort of engagement with the public in terms of how they developed that particular offer. So I think there has been a certain amount of people going, you know, if we do the show, then they will come, and not actually necessarily thinking about what it is that people need, or doing the same sophistication of audience development that was happening pre-pandemic. Now, clearly, there are some very good reasons for that, and a lot of things have had to happen in a hurry. And so I'm not trying to kind of beat anybody up over that, but I think it's one of the things that probably, you know, will need to shift over time, especially if we want to get away from this thing of it being for an ever kind of shrinking group of people who are already in the loop. And one of the things I would sometimes like to ask arts organisations, not just in the current situation, but previously, is what do you do offline to promote your online activity? You know, how do you recruit people to that aren't already the ones who are participating in your social media channels, and that, you know, already know what you're doing? So are you kind of going beyond? And I think there are a lot of ways in which people have become more connected through the digital. But the flip side of that is that there are also a lot of people who are getting less connected and becoming more isolated because of everything being online. And there's an equivalent of that within people's staffing as well, that there's some breaking down of silos in terms of who's talking to who, but there are also people who are being left behind and feeling very lonely and lacking their usual support structures. So I think cultural organisations really need to kind of question that and question how they're putting their programs together and who they're really reaching, and we do need more research in those terms.
Jonathan, I think that's a really good segue into the second part of what we were thinking of talking about, which is what specific tools or approaches have been developed to enhance the kind of qualities and skills that came into place to respond. I mean, I've noted before that Martin works as a freelance coach and trainer and consultant, and you had mentioned in your bio that you're developing or have developed an online course in response to the post-COVID environment. So it'd be interesting to hear, both from the education training perspective, you're in what things are being developed, tools or courses or however, and what you see in the, or observe in the sector that is helping increase the skills that we need. Martin, do you have anything
yeah, I think it's, in my view, like a systematic response, especially in capacity building and education, hasn't really started. What I've seen is a lot of funding which is available, and some of it really substantial money with quite shorthand application procedures that allowed institutions to, like, for example, even buy infrastructure, buy IT software, IT hardware, to then be able to, for example, as a museum, stream from the opening of a new exhibition which wasn't really open. So there is some capacity building in terms of infrastructure, but I don't see a lot of education work going on. I don't see a lot of capacity building within the organizations going on, neither on the like really well, core skills for the digital sphere, nor on the leadership side. And maybe it's too early for that, but I do definitely see a huge need. And even before the COVID crisis, the whole field of human resource in arts organizations and developing skills of your staff was something that lags behind by years and years compared to the professional corporate sector. So I think this seeing your staff as a core resource of the organization and developing their skills and also embracing the skills that are there and trying to put them to work. It's something where the institutions are lagging behind. Us as an a university, we're trying of course to work with our students to prepare them for like future skills, and we have a project going right now which we call Learning Laboratory, where we ask the students to define the curriculum of the future that they would like to have, and also define the learning approaches that work for them in the 21st century. So we try to ask these questions, but we're also at the point of asking the questions. I can't present ready answers what actually will be needed in the future. But I think every university needs to ask these questions and like rethink their curriculum, as the practice needs to rethink their practices right now.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, did you want to add anything to your previous comment?
Yes, well, you mentioned the online course that I'm developing, which is part of our work on arts fundraising and philanthropy. But actually, that course was something that was already in the pipeline before the crisis, and now, of course, it's about adapting the content to reflect that, and it's not ready yet. And so watch this space; we'll let you know. But I think. Sorry, my connection dropped out and then came back in again. But I think I heard Martin saying that the education sector tends to be a little bit behind the curve as far as events are concerned with fitting appropriate content to the circumstances, especially in a fast-moving situation that we've had in recent months. And I think that's true, and I think it's quite difficult to fit that wisdom. You need the research, you need the data, you need the approaches, and you need to perhaps question some of the models. And I think that's where actually the perspective you were talking about, Catherine, at the beginning, about having a foot in the camp of academia, and also having a foot in the sector as well, and to make sure that those things are talking to each other is really, really important. If I could mention one other thing, just going back to around sort of models of leadership and what we've seen going on. Martin was saying earlier that there's been a lot of, the larger organisations letting go of their more kind of centralised ways of doing things. But actually, I think I've seen both things going on, and with some organisations, there has been almost a kind of shortening of the communication channels and a grasping of greater control, which, if you look at theories around leadership in terms of what drives greater centralization, then crisis always does that, because organizations have to take control of their message and their resources. And I think there are some old style leaders who are very pleased to actually get quite a lot more authoritarian and tell people what to do and be invested with the authority doing it. There are other organizations that we've seen where they've admitted that leaders don't have all the answers. They've wanted to work with greater empathy, actually show some vulnerability, and get more responses from other levels of their organization and audiences. And I think we may need to adjust some of our models in thinking, what's appropriate and what fits certain circumstances. Because it's clear that many, many different types of response are possible. It's not yet clear which of them longer term are going to be the most effective.
Right. Johan, do you have anything you'd like to add into this concept of how we need to adapt and where things might be adapting?
Yeah, I was thinking about the image of push and pull. Somewhere the question needs to arise of permanent development and education and change, and I don't see much of it in the sector itself. I see more short-term knowledge gaps being filled. So perhaps it's our responsibility to actually, stand up and say that there is also the option of actually rethinking the practice and rethinking models and rethinking how we've been dealing with each other over the past 30, 40, 50 years. I don't see very quickly how to open up that discussion. Where should we start? Because we don't want to be the ones who know everything better, and it doesn't make much sense to actually dream up new models if the sector is not going to adopt them or help us develop them. So I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I think one of the things that, well, when I was working in the sector, things broadly within culture and various disciplines, everything moves so quickly in terms of, especially if you're in a production cycle in some way, either the creation, the supportive creation, the distribution of it, the engagement with audiences, whatever it is, the business model that we've had for the last decades has been to produce work. So I think this speaks back to what you had said, Johan, when we reach a point where restricted from producing that work or putting your emphasis on producing it, and how do you shift the paradigm so you're looking more at the experience or the participation, or even as far as the right to cultural expression, to pick up on one of the earlier panels today around the Rome Charter. So it's how do we, can we imagine that we could put in place something that would get us to there? I think there's a sense that from some parts of the cultural sector, and perhaps it's younger generations in the cultural sector, that there is a greater desire for it to be, the production to be more connected to the experience, as you said. But what do we need to do that? Jonathan, you mentioned a real need for research, I mean, which is probably something very nice to hear from a program that's into cultural leadership research. So I think that's true. That does take time. Do we have the time, or is there the willingness to put the time in and the reflection in and make the changes?
Well, I don't think we have very much choice as far as that's concerned. You know, I think we need to have strategies informed by data. I think there's going to be very difficult decisions and processes to come. You know, within certainly from the UK experience, we're looking at a situation where something like 30% of the jobs in arts, performing arts, and music have been lost in the last 12 months. That's some 55,000 jobs. You know, and trying to get back to the stage, even if we were able to start opening venues from tomorrow, you know, there are processes that need to be managed there, and it's not going to happen all at once in terms of building audiences back up. So we need to also understand what the audience relationships, those you know, to those developments are. There's been some research from the Audience Agency in the UK, which shows that firstly, you know, young people are much more likely to come back to venues sooner. So as of December, I think something like 27% of under 24-year-olds had actually organised something the next couple of months, just before we hit the new lockdown at that point. But only 8% of over 45 had that intention. So, you know, I think we can expect to see a quite different audiences even once we are able to get back into live circumstances. And there's also been other changes that have gone on, like there's been a greater engagement in disabled audiences for online activities, but there's been, you know, lower engagement from some older audiences. So there are opportunities here, but there's problems. You know, there are some barriers that are coming down, and there are other barriers that are being put up. So we do need to know a lot more about that, so that organisations can plan effectively and actually serve their communities properly when they get back up and running.
I think a similar statistic was presented about the situation in the Netherlands, and the number of, well, not so much jobs lost, but contracts that were not, so individual jobs lost, that contracts were not extended. I wonder, we see a loss in jobs because of this and because of the financial model. Can you imagine new categories of jobs, new roles that will become evident, will become needed? as we go forward. I mean, one of the things we saw in past years is an increased need in digital capacity or capacities in working with social media and that sort of thing. So that was rather an obvious one. Do you see roles that are going to need to come in both in the, one could say, the recovery or the rethinking or the redesign of the cultural sector?
Well, I think that there will be some innovative organisations that will emerge from this, that will have found ways of doing things that that make sense to audiences and their communities, and who will kind of appear in the cracks in a way, you know, like new growth of the grass. I think also one thing that the established organisations are going to have to recognise is that there may be permanent changes to audience expectations. Even in the course of the last year, I think we've seen some changes in terms of digital engagement. You know, feedback from one of our cultural organisations in Leeds was around, you know, people now being better equipped with their technology to plug their laptops into their TVs and watch, you know, your streamed performances on their big screen. And so suddenly that makes a demand of the production values you've got to put on. And the improvisations that we had in the first weeks down, where you could just kind of do anything and it was just great something, actually audiences won't tolerate that for much longer, because people are expecting the quality to get ramped up. So there will be some bigger technical demands coming through, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Martin?
Yeah, maybe in addition to that, a field where I also see a big need arising, and partly due to the coming economical crisis of the arts funding, again, at least in those systems where it's highly public funding, and public money will be rare in the future. Right now, there's a lot of money in the system, but I think as tax income will go down, the economic crisis in the aftermath of the health crisis will continue. The subsidies in the arts funding will be questioned publicly. And the legitimization of using tax money for arts organization will be questioned, especially in those systems like, again, the German language region, where it's traditionally quite high in comparison. And I think those organizations will survive, where members of the communities say, we need this organization who are surprising. So talking about a theater, not your subscription audience. Everybody knows that they'll protest if their theater gets less money. But the moment a theater or a museum is able to alert communities that are not the typical audiences of that community, that will convince people that there is a relevance beyond just like a historical role of these institutions. And I think this leads to the need of audience development and of the knowledge how to build relationships with audiences and with not yet audiences, with other players in your local regional communities, to give them the experience that it's good to have a theater in your town, that it's good to have a museum in their town, even if they might not go to the exhibition, or even if they might not go to the production on the stage. And I think, again, that's definitely underdeveloped also in international comparison in the German context, to have people who really are savvy in building these relationships and collaborating with other institutions, collaborating with communities. And I think one example from the digital context is Igor Levitz, not as an organization, but as an artist, who really perfectly used the pandemic to increase engagement and contact with his audiences, and really kind of made them feel having a personal relationship with that particular artist. And I think that's a competence that many organizations lack, and I do see the need for this role in the future much more than in the past.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And in the north part of Holland, we're involved now in a long-term research project on cultural democracy, and we try to flesh out why culture, particularly for nichtbezoeker, for the almost almost visitors, why it plays a role for them at all. And I think one of the developments that we've seen happening over the past years, at least in Groningen, is the need for what we call a cultural social intermediary. Because what you also notice is, yes, there are communities who are able to formulate why certain cultural office is important for them, but usually it's not on the basis of artistic quality type of reasons that this necessity is being formulated. The necessity comes from other realms. And so we have to open up that discussion as well. We do not need to legitimize the existence of a schouwburg or a theater space only on the basis of the plays that are being performed there, but on the basis of the societal role it has for a community or for a city at large, going way out further than just the building that we are usually talking about. And it's a very interesting, it requires information and knowledge about what the cultural life world of people already is, and how traditional cultural offer from institutionalized parties connects to that or doesn't.
A greater, well, whether you call it knowledge or understanding or connection. I mean, Jonathan, you referred to relationships, so how you build those relationships with community. And as Martin said earlier, talking about the cultural organization as a leader in the community and as a community resource. Maybe with that, well, actually, someone's brought exactly the same question in. I was going to ask you to think about whether you call it our post-COVID normal, and not necessarily post-crisis, but post-COVID, what it will look like, how we either individually, organizationally, and sectorally can be more crisis-proof or crisis-resilient in the future. So a little bit picking up on what Johan has just been saying, and this positioning of cultural organizations as a community resource. Can you have a look into the future from your perspective? I know we don't have the answers, but you're people that have this one foot in both places, and what are the things that we need to make sure what practices stay and what practices go, so that we don't slip into previous behavior. I know, Martin, you think a bit skeptical about shifts in that way, but perhaps skepticism, keeping a healthy dose of skepticism, what is it that we would need to do?
Yeah, I mean, in a quote that's been cited heavily in the first few months in Germany is that, I think Churchill quote, "Never waste a good crisis." So using the crisis in order to foster future strength and future flourishing. My personal skeptical perspective is that there will be one step post-COVID, which will be the attempt to go back to what people might consider normal, the pre-COVID normal. And I think there is even some reason to go that direction, because once a museum can reopen, once a theater can reopen, there is still the old audience around, and they will be longing for just being able to go back. So there will be a certain need, but it's the need of the traditional audiences. And I think to cater to them first makes sense in a way, because you know how to do that as an organization. So that might be the first step. And I think so a lot of the potential of this moment of the innovation will not immediately be taken into the post-COVID moment. I'm quite sure that the next crisis is around the corner, though, and that will be a funding crisis, and it will be a crisis of relevance and legitimization of the public funding. And that will be the moment when I think people will go back to experiences from the pandemic moment and try to bring it into life. So like a second order or second level innovation, not immediately post-COVID, but in the need of like proving the social relevance in the light of a funding crisis around the corner. And that, in a way, it's a pessimistic way of being optimistic, because it would be much nicer if it wasn't due to this kind of a danger of losing money. But I do think it will need that kind of pressure. But once that pressure comes, I'm quite sure there's a lot to be learned and delayed learning is better than no learning in a way. So it's my way of trying to be optimistic.
So you're optimistic that we will have had some learning here that will help us weather the next crisis. Slightly different, sort of echoes of COVID, if I could say.
Yes, that's the best way of putting it.
Yeah. Jonathan.
Well, I think, you know, we all want to talk about what might be the post-pandemic period or the post-COVID period, but I think the first thing we have to look at is perhaps a transition period that there's going to be sort of towards that landscape. And it may be that we're never quite in a totally post-COVID period. You know, if we've got something that's going to become endemic, and if we've got the threat of similar events in the future. I was having a conversation with my wife the other day, and she said to me, you know, are we really in, for example, a post-AIDS period? You know, we have to learn to live with and accommodate these things, and some things have to be done differently. One of the things that came out of the audience agency research was that, you know, audiences wanting to come back into venues, they really want to know how those venues are going to ensure their safety, and they also want to know about the refund situation. So, you know, there might be different things, just in small pragmatic terms, that organisations need to get on top of and think about how they're going to communicate differently, how they're going to lay themselves out and set themselves up. And that's before we even think about the, you know, the economic ramifications for that and what it does for organisations' business models. But I want to mention a couple of things, I think, around policy that perhaps need to be addressed as we move forward, especially if we don't want to just go back to, you know, the same old ways of doing things and the same problems. Because in employment terms, you know, where we've got the biggest crisis in the creative sector is amongst those people who have least secure employment in the first place, and particularly freelancers, who are very much the oil in the wheels of the sector as well, and have a lot of the key skills, and without them, the whole thing grinds to a halt. But we're losing them very fast at the moment. So, you know, what needs to be done policy-wise to support them? I know the City of Manchester recently has just announced an emergency fund for the freelance creative workers. You know, but do we need some kind of support mechanism that actually makes that sector more secure on a more permanent and structural basis? Another thing I think that has to be addressed is whether we have the right kind of understandings of the distinction between something like what we might once have called the commercial sector and what we would call the publicly funded sector. That apple cart has been radically overturned at the moment, and within, for example, the UK Cultural Recovery Fund, there's traditionally commercial organisations who are applying for those resources and need them as well. And one of the things they're pointing out is actually the relationships they have with the traditionally publicly funded organisations for whom they become perhaps the venues, and whose marketing mechanisms they access, and so on. So I think we need to have a more sophisticated understanding of cultural ecology and the forms of support necessary to keep that going. And the other question that perhaps, you know, I'll put out there, and others might be better qualified to answer than me, is what is going to be a cultural organisation's relationship to owning buildings in the future? You know, the one thing that you really don't want to be in charge of right at this moment in time is a building that you have to maintain but you can't actually use. You know, what we once thought of as resources are currently great drains. Is that going to get flipped back around again? Are we going to see an end to the great, you know, building projects which had already perhaps declined, sort of white elephant, great cultural landmark type buildings? Are we going to have organisations looking to share spaces in different ways?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Johan?
I had something in mind which connects to what John said. I think that I think policy needs to react adequately, but at the same time, it's also the cause of many of the problems that we're dealing with now, and particularly the unmovability of policy thinking about culture, and in terms of the traditional top-down offer philosophy, as opposed to the more participatory or representational perspective on of the cultural ecology. But somehow I think it's also perhaps a little bit naive on our part to think that we are going to be shifting paradigms and things are going to go to another new quasi-stable situation. I think the volatility of the situation is going to be the fundamental design variable, so to speak. Horrible word, design variable, but in this case, you understand what I mean. So we need to be able to respond to changes of the magnitude of a COVID pandemic, and at the same time maintain a discourse about the importance of arts in society and culture in society that does not flip from left to right depending on that type of crisis.
Yeah. There's a question from Nona Markarian which relates to this as well, with respect to consumer behavior and audience behavior. Nona, would you like to pose your question to the panel?
I think she's probably not in this.
No, she's in
I think, but
she's
through the stream, right? So.
Are you talking with me? Okay. Yeah. No. I'm here. I posted the question in the chat.
Okay, I see, Eileen. So it's come from the other.
Yeah, but I want to encourage the ACMC audience to ask more questions.
Well, perhaps we just can address this one. Her question is, can you make any predictions or a forecast for the post-pandemic period, precisely in the aspect of audience behavior or consumer behavior in commercial terms? You did talk a little bit, our panel did talk a little bit about the expectations, especially of the digital environment, and the fact that there might be a different demographic that would return for a number of reasons, and the expectations of a safe environment that they were going into if there is going to be physical, if they're physically going to be going to a cultural space. I mean, I think that's looking at the question of accessibility in an even more more scrutiny under the question of accessibility, because it's not even just about whether you have stairs or not. It's how safe the whole thing is. So is there anything else that you could add to this that you already have in terms of what audience behavior would look like?
Maybe I can address one short term and one long term thought, and I'd be very keen to hear more from the panel and also from the participants. One thing to add to also what Jonathan already said to this question, I find is I was talking to somebody, the head of digital services for the Haus der Geschichte, the House of History in Bonn, like a German historical archive and collection and museum. And she said they're already preparing that the way an exhibition works will need much more space in the future, because our sense of feeling safe in a physical space changes. And where in the past, probably we had this experience of, wow, it's great that so many people are in here. It shows this is the place to be. It shows I'm part of a group which knows where the action is, in a way, where interesting stuff is happening. Right now, it might feel frightening, and we will want to have more space around us to feel safe and healthy in an exhibition space. So even blockbuster exhibitions, in a way, will have to address that. That we might not want to be as close for quite a long time, even post the pandemic COVID situation. So that's one aspect I really found very interesting. That museums are already also at the point where they start reflecting on this and preparing other physical layouts for future exhibitions. Much more long-term a question I have, and that relates to audience behavior, because I think this will be the driving force in terms of going beyond the digital analog division is that I sometimes tend to think if in a decade we were listening to our discourses around digital today, we might think them laughable on many levels, because somehow they're so strictly drawing a divide between the digital and the analog, and also the discourse, particularly around museums but also theaters, insisting in the first few months of the pandemic that the digital is no substitute for the physical. And Johan made a reference to it at the beginning of this panel. I think that it will be much more fluid, much more easy embedded practices which move from what we now call digital and what we now call analog, but probably this distinction won't work any longer. And that might be something which would probably happen faster outside artistic organization context, but the audiences will bring it into their expectations of how they encounter artistic organizations. And so maybe we're moving towards something you could call post-digital, not in terms of that digital is no longer relevant, but it's so obvious and so self-evidently everywhere that the distinction doesn't work along the same lines as it does right now. And I think that'd be very interesting to think about that some more, and how that might then really be concretely reflected in the work of an arts organization.
So Nona continued, which I think you've touched on, in simple words, what if the audience gets used to a digital version of concerts, that when the real ones are back, organizers will struggle to have a real audience. So I think you've made a very good and compelling point here about we tend to make these separate worlds where until they come together, and they are coming together. I mean, I think the fact that such a high percentage of the world is connected always by the cell phone in their hand or their pocket or their bag, we are all connected all the time through digital ways as well as through. So it's just how that becomes less visible or less of a barrier. But I'm not sure if there's anything else to add to that. Jonathan.
Yeah, I would worry probably a little less about that, because I think that although I think we have all of these problems about transition that have been mentioned, I think in terms of audience appetites, it's great that we can see more things happening digitally, and I think that the digital provision by arts organisations will get ever more sophisticated. And in the same way that we talk about the way in wartime and other times of crisis, you have these great leaps forward in terms of technology that then have unforeseen uses and consequences subsequently. I think we'll probably see that with the leaps forward there have been in communications technology and the sort of platforms we're using right now in the pandemic. And it may be that it's that digital provision moves on from being the kind of passive thing that you might see as the equivalent of Web 1.0 through to the more interactive things like Web 2.0, and then it becomes the ever expanding ways that become more blended with everyday life subsequently. But I do think people will want to go back to live events, and even if I don't want to sit in looking at my computer watching an orchestra, for example. I cannot get anything like the experience of concert hall and feeling those reverberations coming through my feet, and the same goes for many other forms of live music and many other forms of live art. So I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think we have to look at the way in which things complement each other. And it puts me in mind of when people used to say, I'm going to show my age here, but does anybody else remember the debates about home taping killing music and things like that? You could do this at home, and so therefore you wouldn't go and buy records. But actually, some of these other things are the ways in which art forms are spread. So I think that's the way in which the cultural sector will need to engage with them.
Hyland, do you want to raise your question yourself that you put in the chat?
Yeah, I turned off the audio. I hope there is no echo. I cannot hear anything, but I wanted to ask if there is, or how could you maybe work towards that there's an awareness of the cost of production of digital offers? Because I mean, the digital offers work really well when it's all cost-free, and then a lot of people attend, which is great, from all around the world. However, also those productions cost a lot of money, and I see that as soon as you install kind of a paywall, that is hindering people to attend. And we're just so used to get loads of entertainment for free on the web that I see kind of an obstacle for the future there. Thank you. And also, I mean, the role that Europe plays there. I mean, how can we, you know, maybe create something together that is kind of a competition for the US market also and the giants?
Any of the panelists want to take that on? Martin.
Yeah, maybe I can relate to what Johan said in the beginning. I mean, one of Johan's arguments was that the digital offers sometimes had much more attention and much more participation, visitors, you could say, than what was originally planned for the physical in a physical space in those first months of lockdown. And so to have digital offers for free, I think, is one huge contribution to like be present in public discourse and have relevance for arts organizations. At the same time, there is a debate also going on in Germany. Will we look back at the pandemic as the moment when we missed the opportunity to monetize digital, because so much was for free in those first few months? And I think that's really two sides to the argument, because on the one hand, I completely agree with Johan's perspective, saying it's great that this stuff was free, and it's great that at least gave some opportunity to participate in aesthetic experiences online when it wasn't possible in the physical space. On the other hand, like Eileen says, there is a cost to producing this, and that cost doesn't get visible if everything is free. And so I think there are some interesting ways of monetizing that have been used in the past few weeks and months, particularly around live music, and they seem to be working okay compared to the first few weeks of the pandemic. At the same time, what I would love to have, and that might be a European approach, is a debate, why not a flat rate for arts, at least in the digital sphere? So as museums in some countries don't charge for entry because they're already funded with tax money, why not say publicly funded arts organizations do their online work for free and get the money for that through taxpayers' money to show really this is something we see as a human right, even we see as something that's a citizen right to be able to participate in artistic experiences online without having to pay on top of what you have already paid as a taxpayer for funding the organizations. But I think if we go in that direction, that needs to be much more explicit. Right now, it's this implicit cost, and I think that there is a need for a debate how to go forward around this question of monetizing or funding digital offers. Yeah.
Quirijn, did you want to add some comment to that? You put something in the chat in relation to monetizing.
Yes, I could. If I take a public perspective or a public policy perspective, indeed, you would think of digital possibilities as great opportunities to enhance participation and to widen it, and maybe to segments of audiences that are hard to reach. And I think it's a question for the future. I really am struggling to think what I would choose as a politician or as a policy advisor, to say let's let's take the prerogative that publicly funded institutions should provide access freely on the internet because they are publicly funded, and then charge for live performance, which will make that much more exclusive again. And that's one of my biggest fears that will come out of this crisis, that indeed a lot of the culture will enhance its exclusivity of culture will be enhanced rather than widened. But on the other hand, you could also say, yeah, it's a logic that there is a difference between live available and digitally available and then freely available types of offers, and it also depends on audiences in that sense. And we could ask something different of public institutions or publicly funded institutions than of privately funded institutions, but also that's a distinction I think the audience now already hardly ever sees. You don't see the culture comes through channels to people, and they don't recognize these channels as being publicly funded or not. They simply see there's a building there. There is a internet connection availability. However it got there is not their problem. It should not be their problem, by the way. So I have a hard time making a decision here. It's really a question.
We have about Johan, please.
Yeah, I would like to add a little bit. There's a big tendency to still try to reason about this in terms of what we know as the reality before pandemic, which I think is and one of the issues that was mentioned briefly is the dichotomy between a subsidized and commercial offers. And I think there's at the beginning of the pandemic, I checked out at the websites of a couple of large global cultural players, because we have some extremely rich representatives of our sector as well, like Live Nation, for instance, or the Disney Corporation, to see how they, whether, if so, how they try to form some kind of a vertical solidarity, as I call it. And does Live Nation support the global pop music sector with their money, and what does Disney do? And the things they did were marginal, if not. I think that what I remember from the Disney website is that they decided to give away all the sandwiches that could not be sold anymore in the shops of their venues. And Live Nation had a $750,000 fund set up for the entire globe to support small pop music, pop bands that were struck by the crisis. I think there's a lot to be said about opening up the discussion about their responsibility for the arts form that they represent, and not just for the stockholders that they represent. And I think there's a lot of money there, and there's also more money in society among people than we may think. So I think perhaps, we don't know, we perhaps should find out. It is possible to have people pay more for offers that are more expensive in their production, as long as they consider the value to be worth the money that they need to pay for it. So that should be, I think, the first question: how do people value what the different offers, whether digital or live or commercial or subsidized?
But even in the subsidized world, we have some very high-priced offers.
Yeah, true.
Tickets to the opera, or you could compare that to tickets to musicals, but which are generally more commercial than subsidized, but tickets to the orchestra and so on. It's and those are situations where they are generally relatively well, in actual euro, well subsidized. It may not be a very big percentage of their overall budget because they are relying a lot on ticket sales, hence the increase. So you're caught in this, yeah, how do we we get out of that? Because I think publicly, the value of public money going into the arts is that it should be then accessible to everybody, and it's not when there's an entry price. So greater work in this time and in the post, well, let's just call it 2021 and forward, not post anything, in how we are more accessible and how we are more inclusive. And in order for that to be, the product also has to change, which goes back to whether or not the status quo will prevail and we will try to continue in the same way we had, or whether it'll be enough of a shock to actually change things.
I don't think there's an imperative on organisations to offer all of their material online for free simply because they're a publicly funded organisation, any more than there would be for them to open up the doors to their venue for free because they're publicly funded. I think it is for each organisation to think about that from the perspective of its mission and how it makes itself adequately accessible to its public, and how it puts together the sustainable business plan overall, which the subsidy is supposed to help with, but not substitute for entirely. So I think there are one or two distractions in that debate and in that logic, perhaps. But it would certainly make no sense for any organisation, whether publicly funded or fully commercial, not to have some freely accessible content in the modern day and age, so as to be able to connect with audiences, whether for public or for commercial reasons. So I think that there's going to be a blended approach, and there's perhaps quite a lot that unites those sectors more than you might sometimes think.
Right. I think we have probably a minute at best left in our time. Would any of you like to add anything final to what we've talked about? I mean, we're around the question of leadership. I think one of the big questions you raised is there adequate leadership, however you define that.
Is there adequate leadership? Yeah.
To lead a change.
To lead a change, it's complex, but I don't know. Perhaps what we could conclude from today is that it's very difficult to make any prediction into the future, and we've touched upon so many different aspects that could be the driver, could turn out to be the driver, like consumer behavior or development of new artistic forms and audience engagement methods. It's a challenging question, and I hope we will be able to be in the forefront of change. But perhaps we should do this again in a year's time and see what happens.
Yeah. I think one of the key elements, and also came out in Helene's presentation, is a sense of need for responsiveness, for flexibility and nimbleness, which I think if we don't embed that in our systems, we're not going to be resilient enough, which will result in resilience. Keeping one's eyes open and responding as best as possible, and knowing that it's you're making it up as you go along, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The crystal ball remains a little cloudy.
It does indeed. With that, I'd really like to thank all three of you for participating, and to the audience that stayed along with us. Apologies again for any technical glitches we've had. So I think maybe our digital systems are getting a little tired and overworked this week, but it's been so far a very full week, and there are still more sessions to enjoy and participate in. But thank you so much for what you've brought, your perspectives, reflections, and to the degree possible, gazing into a crystal ball. So thank you so much.